And this is not going to be totally lecture format, so I'm hoping that we get some dialogue going here. So anyway, as Larry said, tonight and next Wednesday, I'm going to talk about environmental ethics. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, the perspective I'm taking and what I'm going to talk about is the issue of what's right and wrong and how do we decide what's right and wrong with regards to land, creation, nature, however you want to describe that. So in essence, this is ethics separate from personal ethics between people, between cultures. So the focus is, as I say, on what is the relationship and what are the oughts, right and wrong actions that are different perspectives set up as how we ought to have a relationship with nature. So that's the context for the next couple of weeks, that subject in general. As I'm sure all of you guys know here, this is one of those feature issues in what we call the culture wars these days. This is one of those issues where what we have is basically two polarized positions where the intent is to find one-line salvos to annihilate the other side. And so we spend our time firing, trying to destroy the other side. I don't think anybody here came to gain ammunition for that, so that's not my intent here at all. In fact, one of the things I'm going to start with is I don't think either of those sides has the moral high ground. So that's one of the things where I'm going to go tonight. Okay, so as Larry said, I'm going to start out by articulating three common views. And so my plan here is just to give you a snapshot. Now, there's a whole gambit from one end of the spectrum to the other and places in the middle. There's probably as many positions as there are people involved in this issue. So what I'm basically doing is just giving you a little caricature, a little snapshot that captures the basic features of each. And I just want to do that to start the conversation, just so we know what the lay of the land is. And then I want to just examine those views a little bit tonight. So that's where we're headed. Okay, let's see if I can do the technology here. That's always a challenge for me. Yes. Okay, so I want to begin talking about environmental position A. And so, I'll put A over here. It doesn't matter, really. Okay, so this is position A. The ultimate good is material prosperity. That's the ultimate good for mankind. So in this view, what's the purpose of nature? The purpose of nature is to meet man's material needs. What's the immediate good? Profit. That's what we're in this business to do. That's what we're in this relationship with nature to do. What's the mechanism of decision-making with regards to this view? Supply and demand. That determines what our actions are and what we're going to do with regard to nature. The model of dominion is an absolute ruler. Man's responsibility is to maximize his economic efficiency. So, in this view, does nature have intrinsic worth? The answer is no. In this perspective, nature does not have intrinsic worth on its own. And is it necessary to protect all species? No. There isn't any mandate to do that. So this is a snapshot of position one. I'll go back and review those quickly. So the ultimate good here is material prosperity. Purpose of nature in this view is to meet man's material needs. And the most immediate need here is for profit. And the mechanism of decisions are supply and demand. The model of dominion, man is an absolute ruler over nature in this model. And man's responsibility here is to maximize his economic efficiency. And so, does nature have intrinsic worth? No. Is it necessary to protect all species? Okay, with that caricature, any questions or anything you want to interact with? Do you sort of see a view? Most of them, yes. Yeah. Well, what this is, Yeah, go ahead and ask the question again.
would this position actually make the statement that nature does not have intrinsic worth, even apart from what benefit it brings man?
And my answer is, of course, this is in other words, I'm just picking out a snapshot, but a majority of them would not. This is the Enlightenment position or the modern position. So this is the view of Western civilization for the last 400 years, something like that. And in that view, the way man sees nature is that we, through science, learn how nature works for the purpose of taking control of it absolutely to maximize our economic efficiency. That is the view. So that's the dominant view in Western culture that came through the Enlightenment and the modern period. I'll give you an example of it now. I was going to save it for later, but I'll give it to you now. In 1906, a famous fish biologist proclaimed that in 1906, we now have the technology to grow salmon without rivers. We don't need rivers anymore to grow salmon. And he was making this announcement as a grand achievement of man, that we can actually grow salmon in the Pacific Northwest without rivers. We don't need nature. In fact, the whole point of this thing is to replace nature and the mechanism of nature with our technology. So over time, that is the view, that we take total control of nature to manage it to maximize our economic efficiency. So this is the dominant view of the last 400 or 500 years that we have been working towards. Now, in that, of course, there's going to be people that disagree with these. So I'm just giving you a snapshot of a caricature of a position, but this is a dominant position that has been out there for a long time now and still plays a dominant role. Yes. Whoop, just a sec.
So by caricature, you're saying, in what you're showing us now, we shouldn't take it very serious.
Well, I'm just saying this is a position that a lot of people over a lot of period of time have taken with regards to how we should treat the natural world.
Sorry, I didn't ask that correctly. I'm sorry. Excuse me. What I mean is, actually, you did cover it. Never mind. That's good. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. So are we good with this one?
Charlie, can I ask one question?
Sure.
Would you say that the kind of position that you're laying out here would be similar with regard to other things having to do with nature, like medicine or something like that? Man's relationship with nature here would be similar in terms of his relationship to nature in terms of the environment compared to, say, the relationship that man has towards his own body or something along those lines?
Well, it might or might not. I'd have to think about, because there's a lot of people and there's a lot of
positions.
And there's a lot of positions that are taken, so I'd have to really think about that. But I mean, there is the modern perspective that we are just chemical machines, that's what we are. And that's roughly the same thing, if that's where you were headed.
Yeah.
That yes, I mean, from Darwin and Freud on, the description, the understanding of what it means to be a human being now is that we are chemical machines. So notice that anytime we have an ailment, there's a pill for it. That's related to this that's related to this position. Even if it's psychological or what, a whole bunch, we've got a pill to fix this because we're nothing more than chemical machines. In the end, that's what nature really is. It's just a chemical machine that actually we can operate more effectively than nature could. That's the guts of this view. Is that the kind of thing you were after?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Yes, Karina.
I saw an article today. They were talking about using fungi in space to grow things and solve a whole bunch of problems. Would that perspective be included in this? So it's not something that's like, we're not so much replacing nature because nature can do some cool things,
Right.
but we're going to harness it as a technology for our own ends. And
Well,
go
ahead.
Sort of improve on it maybe, or use it to do something that nature hasn't figured out yet because we're so smart. Does that fit into this?
Well, that's a real.
That was in the article there.
Yeah.
Verbatim.
That's related, but it's not exactly the snapshot I've done,
Okay.
but it's related. There's a reason I'm doing these snapshots.
Okay.
So kind of bear with me a little bit. Like I say, if we get down to it, there's probably as many positions as there is people involved in this issue. So I'm just trying to give you the lay of the land here, the spectrum of what's out here in broad terms. Okay, so are we all right with this one? Okay, let's try position B, which is the opposite extreme. So position B, the ultimate good is a spiritual connection with God. That's the ultimate good of nature in this position. The purpose of nature is wilderness is sacred. This is where we go to experience God. The immediate good is one, minimize our material impact on nature and experience God. And the extreme versions of this perspective is we actually need to diminish our population or get rid of man entirely because man is a parasite on the natural world. Man is a parasite that's bound to destroy nature. We need to get rid of him. The mechanism of management, government. The government is to establish environmental laws to protect and establish wilderness areas. The government is to set up what we can do and not do within the natural sphere of things. The role of dominion here, the relationship of man to nature is one of worshiper primarily. Now, obviously, we have to meet our material needs, but that's not what's primary in this view. What's primary in this view is that this is where we find meaning and this is where we connect with God. So our responsibility is to tread lightly and protect all the wilderness we possibly can at this point. Does nature have intrinsic worth? Obviously, yes. Is it necessary to protect all species? Yes. So I'm arguing this is the opposite pole. This is the opposite polar perspective as a snapshot. Okay, any questions about this view? or anything you want clarified.
Yeah, yes, please. Where did this come from? We need to get rid of man. He's a parasite.
Let's see. I'm not sure who the first person that says that is. I mean, the roots of this view are in John Muir. John Muir is the person who started this, the root of this. But this version now, the 20th and 21st century version of this, is way different than what John Muir was advocating. But John Muir was advocating that wilderness is sacred and that that's a place to go experience God. So in the basic elements of it, Muir he's the root of this thing, but this thing has grown.
Oh, good.
I've forgotten the names of the groups, but like 5 or 10 years ago, they were really, really popular, especially in Eugene. I mean, there would be meetings of 500 people who were talking about this as their platform. Well, yes, they're not as radical as this. This is the radical. This is the real radical edge. The Sierra and the Club, some of the members of some of the people who would hold this are members of that, but certainly not all of them. No, well, they have a completely different agenda. Theirs is about land. It's not really about nature. Yes. Sure. And the reason, I'll tell you about environmental view B here. I used to co-teach a class with a guy at the CISPAS Center for Arts and Ecology in Lincoln City. I don't know if any of you know it. It's, as you might expect, most of the people are out of Portland, so it's arts and ecology sort of thing. You can probably fill in the rest. I team taught this class with a guy who's one of the leading international terrestrial ecologists. I'll just tell you, our nickname for him is Mad Dog. So I co-teach this class with Mad Dog. And here he is, an internationally known terrestrial scientist. But his view with regard to environmental ethics is exactly this. And he was preaching to the choir at the CISPAS Center. So anyway, it's a very dominant view in those sorts of circles. As I say, I'm presenting endpoints here. So other questions?
Would this group of people see that nature is God, or would they separate God and see God as the creator of nature?
No, in this view, almost universally they are pantheists.
Yes.
So that God is nature,
yes.
And they are divine as well. So as part of nature.
Yes.
So yes. Yeah, and that's one of the places we're going here before we get done.
Okay.
Is yes, and this view is pantheistic with regard to God. God is in nature. That's why you go to wilderness to find him. That's the sacred place. Yes. Let me go back again. Okay. Oh, position A, B, ultimate nature. Okay. Here we are. Okay, our responsibility is to tread lightly. Minimum of material possessions, minimum of carbon footprints, minimum of use of resources. Yeah.
By get rid of them,
Mm-hmm.
is it like, okay, you guys need to just not be here that often? Or, I mean, get rid of them. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a number of versions of this. One version is we need to control our population because our population is so large now that we can't sustain wilderness, we can't sustain nature any longer with the population and with the demands put on it. So we need at minimum for population to decrease. Now, the extreme radicals of this hold a position that nature herself is just going to get hacked off enough at us that she takes us out. That's a very commonly held perspective, that there's going to be some epidemic or some major catastrophe, a couple major volcanoes go off at once, and suddenly there's no crops anywhere in the northern hemisphere for the next 5 to 10 years. That could create some problems. So in their view, nature herself is going to get hacked off enough that she gets rid of us. That's Mad Dog's position. So anyway, does that answer that? So at minimum, we need to decrease the population. But a number of these sorts of people, their view is that in the global ecosystem that exists here, we are really functionally parasites. That's the role we are playing, and we should be absolutely removed from the system. That's the view. Okay, other questions about that view? Okay. Everybody okay with this one? All right. Let's go to the middle position now. So in this position, the good for mankind is to balance our material needs with spiritual needs. The purpose of nature here is moral, spiritual, and meeting our material needs. So, multiple use concept of management of land in the big picture. The immediate good is to provide for our material needs, but at the same time, protect the environment as much as we possibly can. The mechanism for management is primarily governmental legislation, and have the governmental legislation based on the best science. That the best science determines what actions we do are good or bad and how we do those. The model here of dominion, the model of relationship, is that of a steward. So man's responsibility is to be a good steward. So does nature have intrinsic worth? Yes. Is it necessary to protect all species? No. Okay, so to back up, any questions on the middle position then? Our responsibility is to be a good steward. Oh, whoops. Here we go. Immediate good. Trying to balance material needs with environmental protection. Basically, the government and best science drives the management relationships. The model of dominion is a steward. Oh, I need to go back one more. Whoops. There we are. The good for man is balancing material and spiritual needs. And then the purpose of nature being moral, spiritual, and material needs. So it's kind of a middle ground. Okay, questions about that perspective?
So on the last slide.
The last slide.
Well,
the one before this?
I think it's the one after it.
Okay.
Is there one after it?
Yeah, and then one more?
One more, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. So it's not necessary to protect all species. So am I guessing wrong? But it just seemed like it was going in a very Christian direction until that was said. I mean, what do you mean by that? Necessary to protect all species?
Well, is it a mandate for our relationship with nature to protect all species? Is that a good? Well, I'm saying that's the issue that's being raised here. And I'm saying in the position I'm presenting, the answer to that is no.
Okay.
Okay. And I'll give you an example.
Yeah, thanks.
Shall we protect the Anopheles mosquito that carries malaria? Should we do away with the AIDS virus that's a species? I mean, we could name a dozen, 2 dozen right off the bat of those kinds of things. So are we mandated to protect all of those? And I would say no, we're not mandated to protect those in this view. Now in position B, their argument would be, yes, we have no right to decide what species live and die. So in the extreme version of B, they would argue even there we have no right, because we're making those decisions based on our utility, as opposed to the intrinsic value of those organisms in the ecosystem. Yeah, Chris.
When you were mentioning this sort of position to me earlier on today, you suggested that Wendell Berry might be found somewhere kind of in the middle. And in general, the language of stewardship definitely calls to my mind too, and Isaiah mentioned this, a kind of Christian tradition or background or understanding. To what extent is stewardship a concept that secular thinkers and environmentalists share? In particular, the language of stewardship.
Okay. I'd like to hold that off because that's part of the third part of the talk. Okay. Yeah.
Mechanism of protection. We are familiar with that in our country. It was a slide before this.
Yeah.
I know you've traveled internationally. You see how other government entities look at their role as protectors or utilitarians, and legislation and or for protection. Do you see the role of that kind of protection or government's involvement in it as uniquely northwestern hemisphere, or do you see that internationally too when you've traveled, say, to the Soviet bloc or?
It's a little more common in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, little less common in the Soviet Union, especially the far east you go. The farther east you go in Siberia, it drifts a long ways. Southeast Asia, mixed bag. I don't know China. I don't know India. I don't know Southern Hemisphere at all. I don't have any take on that. Does anybody venture? Anybody know any of those well enough to want to venture? I don't know enough to answer the question. Sorry.
I was going to mention that some of these countries where there's a long-standing tradition of animism or pantheism, I'm thinking in particular of Japan, for instance, where native Shinto religion is very pantheistic in all sorts of ways. And it would seem like places like that are very rich soils for position B in this case.
Yes.
Rather than a middle ground so much or a utilitarian.
Yes. Yes. Often people in position B often are trained in Buddhism in the East. I mean, Gary Snyder comes to mind, if you know Gary Snyder. So he's one of the main people that's position B that I have in mind for position B. Okay, so back position C, this middle ground. Is everybody kind of with that? All right. So like I say, I just wanted to lay the landscape here. Just to give you an idea of what's out there. And these caricatures that I presented, they're actually pretty dominant positions, and they form the base of much of the polarity that exists with regards to environmental ethics. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to do a critique. And this isn't a complete critique, but the only point I want to make is they don't hold the moral high ground unless they can answer these criticisms. They can't claim the moral high ground without it. So that's all I want to accomplish by this. So position A, this is the Enlightenment or the modern position we talked about. My critique is this isn't an ethical position with regard to nature at all. It's just flat an economic perspective. So anyone who responds to the environmental issues that presents this as their foundation for ethics, my argument is, I don't see how this is an ethical position at all. This is purely an economic position. There's no ethics in it. So unless you can tell me how we get ethics into this, how they're built in somehow, and here's what's given to me. Well, but the mechanism of supply and demand guarantees that as things get rare enough, they get valuable enough, and we protect them. Let me just say, I've never seen that work with anything that I work with. Salmon in the Northwest, arguably the largest fishery in the world. Second largest fishery is the cod off Newfoundland, never worked there. Never worked in timber. And I'll take the time to give the story, even though I know most of you know it, but it's environmental ethics. I need to do this because this is, and again, most people know it, so I didn't start out. Normally I would start out and lay out where I'm coming from to start with. Who am I and what are my beliefs? I didn't do this since most everybody here knows where I come from. But at this point, I do want to just tell one piece of it. Is I grew up in Michigan. It's the one state the Lower Peninsula you can do this with. In the northern half of the Lower Peninsula, this was characterized as the white pine forests. And the white pine grew from like New York to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And it was said that historically a squirrel could grow up in a white pine tree and make their way to Minneapolis without coming down out of a white pine tree. In Michigan, it took them 20 years to cut them all. They cut them, drove the timber down the rivers, and the native fish in those rivers was called the Michigan grayling. And that fish went extinct. It was the dominant sport fish in this whole area. After they left, this whole area burned. Savage fires that burned villages, people. So it's 200 miles by 250 miles. The whole thing burned over a period of about 10 years. They have no idea how many people died. No estimate whatsoever. And there was a subculture that started in Michigan in that upper Northwest, in the old Northwest Territory, where it was a group of Christians and non-Christians that said they were going to move into that area where all the soil had even been burned. They've got to rebuild the soil enough to grow a garden. They're going to move back in with the purpose of resettling that and reestablishing immunity. That's the culture I grew up in. That seemed to me to be a worthwhile endeavor. Position A is the position that was taken, and it was the explanation for why we took the white pine the way we did, because that's how you effectively harvest the most efficient way. Didn't matter what else was there. So when I was about 5 or 6, I saw my first Michigan grayling in a museum. And anyway, just wondered what it would have been like to have actually seen a real one. That's always run pretty deep. Okay, back to this. So anyway, position A, that was the position that the timber companies took when they took the white pine. Our job in nature is purely material for us to use within the economic system, and our purpose is to harvest this and do it as efficiently from an economic perspective as possible. no one paid much attention to the implications of doing that. There were voices, but they weren't heard. And at that point in time, there was no way that that kind of activity would stop. And once they were done with the Midwest, they came to Oregon to start the same thing out here. And most people who have been around here for a while know that it's been an issue since they got here and still is today. So position A is well held, still held here. As a position with regards to environmental ethics, my critique of that is I don't see that there's any ethics at all in it. It's purely an economic perspective. So I need an answer. So for the people that hold position A, I want an answer of how it's an ethical system. I don't see that it is. Okay, on the other extreme, the question I have for them is, how do you decide what's divine? How do we decide who God is? Where is he? What's divine? I mean, I hear that you have a perspective, but you don't buy what I think is divine. So why should I accept your definition of divine? Why should I accept what's sacred to you if you don't accept what's sacred to me? On what grounds? On what grounds are you claiming this is sacred and divine? I have to have an answer to that. And I want an answer of why mine is not. So far, I haven't seen anybody in position B want to take that one on. And then, how do you decide if God is in nature or not? When you go to the wilderness area, are you experiencing the God that's there intrinsically in nature or something else? Well, that makes a difference again for the same sort of reasons. Is this just wishful thinking? I mean, we're going to see in position B that the majority of people who hold the middle ground position say there is no God, be it in nature or be it anywhere else. There is no God. So right here we have a major debate about what's divine, on what grounds do you believe in divine, on what grounds are you rejecting what I find divine? We need an answer. It seems to me position B needs to give us answers to those kinds of questions. Okay, the critique of the middle position. The dominant position here, and the dominant position of people who actually are in the middle, the majority of them all hold Darwin's theory to be true. Well, from my perspective, with regards to ethics at least, that's a problem. That's a major problem. And why? First of all, in Darwin's position, man is merely an animal. So we're part of nature. So we're not separate from nature. So how is it that we establish what's right and wrong? Secondly, we are not divine in this position. So we aren't morally different from animals. We aren't different from animals at all. So in this position, how do we hold that man is a steward when no other species has a moral mandate? That's not compatible with Darwin's theory. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say there was a species that showed up on Earth that gave off a byproduct that was totally poisonous to every other living form on the planet. What would we say about that? My hunch is we want to say, Well, we need to get rid of it. But the problem with that is, yeah, but wait a minute, that's happened before. Back when the Earth's atmosphere was totally carbon dioxide, a new life form developed that could take up CO2 and gave off this poisonous gas called oxygen. And it killed off all the living life forms that existed before. Well, what do we say about that? It's just nature, man. Well, the point is if that's just nature, man, if we're human beings and we're part of this natural system, who cares if we kill off everything else? On what grounds is it right or wrong? So my point is, if you're going to hold the middle position, you can't hold it if you believe that Darwin's true and have an ethical system that's in any way coherent. It's not possible as far as I can see. So far, I've never seen anyone in the middle group give a defense of that. And I think that's necessary. Okay, so let's stop for a few minutes and let me take questions. Let's just interact with a few things. Just know, here's where I want to go. Where I want to go is, I think, I can't prove this, but having read a number of people across this spectrum, my hunch is we kind of naturally gravitate towards a position. We don't really think about it a whole lot. We're just kind of we naturally just gravitate to sort of a position here. Because we don't really think through what our foundation is. And so I think most of the people here, in fact, I've read quite a lot across this spectrum over the last 60, 70 years. And it's really, really rare that anyone lays out the foundation for why they believe what they believe. And with that foundation, here's where I'm going. So I'll just tell you where we're going. The question I need answered is there a God? What's his relationship to man and creation? Who's man? And what's his relationship to the creation? Now, each one of these three positions has answers to those. But I can tell you that 99% of the books about position A, B, or C never talk about any of those foundations in any significant way. So these positions, I would argue, I may be wrong, and I may be wrong. I'm certainly wrong about a few people. I know that. So I'm not including everybody here. But the majority of people, me included for most of my life, I just kind of gravitated in a direction here. Why? It just felt right. It just felt like this is right. So, but if we're going to build a position, like I say, I want to go look carefully at how we put those foundations together. Because if you're going to build a house, you better build the foundation first, or you got a problem. I think that's analogous with these kind of views. So anyway, that's where I want to go. But let's take a few minutes, see what you want to talk about. Chris.
If possible, I would like to take a devil's advocate position. Not that I agree with this position, but I think it might be helpful to sort of clarify where you're coming from and where you're going and stuff like that. I can imagine for both A and B. Let's take A first. Somebody could take the position that what's most important is man's comfort, for instance. That is a hierarchical decision that you've made, that man's comfort is the most important ethical consideration, or something like that. In which case, it would be ethical to and then the rest of nature would have a much lower kind of in a hierarchy of values or something like that, in which case you might have an ethical obligation to benefit mankind's comfort by, now you could talk about the success with which people have the decisions that they've made, like wiping out the entire forest was a bad decision because in the long run that's stupid, because you're not going to maximize man's comfort in that particular situation. But you could maybe argue that if we can maximize the use of our material resources for the long run and maximize man's comfort or something like that, that could be a position, at least in principle, that somebody could take.
Yes. As I said, there's as many positions as possible as there are people, and we're close to that. I wanted to caricature these three for the particular purpose of looking at the foundations. So yes, that's a position somebody could hold. So they could hold a position close to A, but it wouldn't really be A once I put the foundation on it.
Sure.
But of
it's
course,
a modification of some sort, right?
So of course, there's any number of possible spectrums across this that would be ethical. I'm just arguing that this one, the way it's laid out, and once you see the foundation, it's not I would argue that I have a very, very hard time seeing how the position is an ethical position at all. Because it seems to me that ultimately there comes a place with morals and ethics that you're going to restrain your action for a given level for something of higher purpose. If economic efficiency is the highest goal, then you got a problem. There can't be anything higher than economic efficiency in your value system, if that's the case.
Right. So I guess the question then is why, I mean, your concern was that A wasn't an ethical position at all. It was just an economic kind of a thing.
Right.
I guess, so the question is it possible to sort of paste on top of that a hierarchy of values that says man's comfort is the highest?
Yes,
or something like that.
But what I'm saying is you got to tweak them as they exist now. Sure. Yeah, and you could do it with any of these. You could tweak any of them any number of ways. And we can put different foundations on them and tweak them. That's my point here is that's what we have across the spectrum. And all we're talking about are these characteristics that I've put on the board so far. But we never get to talking about the foundation, which is, it seems to me, where we need to be going to sort these things out if we're ever going to sort them out.
So for instance, in my tweaked position, the place to go would be, on what basis are you claiming that that's the proper ethical hierarchy of values, and how are we going to decide those sorts of things, right?
Right. So see, in position A, I listed that the highest value is economic efficiency. Well, by definition, there can't be a moral or ethic there. The highest value is economic efficiency, period. It's economic, it's not moral. It's not a moral claim at all, it's an economic claim.
Okay.
So when we were talking about foundations, what is revealed when you look at the foundations is what they think the highest good is.
No, actually, just wait on the foundations.
Oh, wait on that?
Because that's what's coming next. That's what's coming next.
Okay.
Yep. Save that question for just the next period of time.
Okay.
So position A, your critique of them is that it's a economic system, not an ethical system.
Yes.
And that you feel they need to answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
I can see someone in position A saying, I don't need to answer that question. It is an economic decision.
That's correct.
Therefore, why are we even having this discussion? Because morals don't enter into it at all.
That's correct.
And
That is the view.
and
yes.
that's their view. And
Yes.
therefore the discussion kind of ends right,
Right.
there, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The discussion ends right there.
Mhm.
Yes, that's correct. And that view is quite widely
Yeah,
held.
yeah.
I run into it a lot.
Charlie, the middle ground view that you've been saying, that strikes me as kind of the most dominant view that I've probably encountered when I hear like people on NPR talking about we need to preserve the environment for the next generation and stuff like that. It just seems like a very moderate view, sort of moderate in America right now, but also pretty common. Flavors of that would be pretty common. And like you're saying, based on Darwin, which is probably the most common basis of science that people have right now, right? So I think from what I've gathered, I feel like something somebody might say to answer the question that you're saying is, well, survival is like what all of this is based on. Like nature, everything in nature is trying to survive. Like that's sort of the ethic. It's built into us. We're trying to survive. And so as humans who are intelligent and have developed to a point where we can sort of interact with that in a more reflective way, we look at it and we see our behavior and we say, well, this isn't going to help us survive. Like there's not going to be coral reefs or forests or oceans with fish for my kids or grandkids if we don't stop. So there's the ethic. We need to think about how we're going to survive, or something like that. Would that be a foundation that people would say? And does that,
Okay,
what
again,
questions would you have?
Again,
Okay.
I'll take that up in just a few minutes.
Sorry.
That's where I was going to.
But part of this is look at what we've already seen from Darwin. If Darwin is really the framework here of the middle position, and it's virtually the foundation for anybody that's a scientist in biology or ecology, I mean, I would guess the non-Darwinians are probably less than 5% of any of those fields. I don't know that they'd be more. They may be less. But if that's the case, and if it is true that man is just an animal in the system, then how is it that we have responsibilities or ethics that no other animal has? How is that even plausible? So that's one piece of it. And the other part of it is look at that example of an animal that created a poisonous substance to every other animal. They don't say that's wrong. That's not wrong. That's just nature. So how can you make the same claim against anything we would do as an animal, part of nature, just like that animal that produced oxygen for the first time and killed everything off? How is it different? See, that's my problem with the position, is it seems to me that there's an incoherence that's not answered, that can't be answered with the foundation that they've laid on the position. Is that, I mean, that's kind of where I'm going in the next portion, but anyway, do you see that? Do you see the problem with what I'm pointing out? Yeah, that is a common position, but again, my problem is, yeah, but what's the foundation it sits on? And I can't make that foundation fit with the superstructure you put on top of it. It's not compatible. I don't see how it's compatible. You got to explain that to me. Yes.
Let me see if I understand this correctly. So it seems to me that your critique of positions A and C is similar in that, and Karina, kind of the direction you were going. So to say that out of mere pragmatic reasons for survival, we want to do this. That's not, Charlie, you're saying, essentially an ethical position in the same way that the economic argument is not ethical. And I mean, from one perspective, you know, for instance, our relation to pencils, for instance, right? There's no question of ethics coming into this, we could say, because they're of no concern. And the same thing is said of the environment in position A, say. But it sounds like where you're going is that ethics should be involved in all that we do. So whether it happens to do with the environment, perhaps even down to the level of penalty, but certainly with something as significant as the environment, as the land, as something that influences us in countless ways, there ought to be some sort of ethical involvement. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
So Chris played devil's advocate with position A. I'd like to play devil's advocate with position B.
Okay.
So your criticism was of position B was that the notion of God is both unclear and potentially arguable, right? Debatable.
Sure.
Is it possible, could you, and maybe this would involve a tweak in the same way that the one for A would too, is it possible to understand, or that people who hold position B understand God, or use the word God, or Gaia, or whatever you want to call it, in a metaphorical way? And Gaia literally, I think, means, well, it comes from Greek earth, right? But kind of a life force, right? So God as life, nature as life. I mean, in a sense, without the natural world, depending on how you define it, we couldn't or wouldn't be here. And in the same way that someone could even say that it's because I respect your understanding of the divine, and I want you to live with that. I want you to live. I want you to search for the divine in your own way. That this protection of nature, which is what sustains and conduces to life, is so important. It's kind of like it ensures the possibility of life, and life, we can all agree, is better than death. The survival of the species is better than the extinction, et cetera, that sort of thing. Would that constitute a tweak of position B? Or would that address your concerns?
Well, it would constitute a tweak. But as I say, when we get to this last section, I think it'll be clear exactly what I want to say about those foundations and the questions raised about them. So at this point, I just want to kind of say, yeah, I would consider that a tweak. Let me just say that. Because, yeah, I mean, I cherry picked these for a reason, but I didn't cherry pick them just because they exactly fit what I wanted to do. But these are three dominant positions. I meet these people all the time. And I interact with A, B, and C about equally. So that's basically what I've been going on. So these are pretty dominant positions. I would say A, B, and C constitute probably 80% of the people that I interact with about these issues. So somewhere in there. I mean, I don't keep score, but I would guess that's in the neighborhood. So, I mean, I'll say this now. Normally I lead with this, but I think now is an appropriate time to say it. I'm blown away that this happens as much today as it did in 1980 when I became a Christian. When I'm working in the field with the eco guys and they find out I'm a Christian, the first question I get within 10 seconds is, how can you possibly be a Christian and an ecologist at the same time? They're incompatible. And still, way more than half of the Christians I'm introduced to that hear I'm an ecologist, their eyebrow goes up. They don't think you can be an ecologist and a Christian. So both Christians and the eco freaks basically say you can't be a Christian and do ecology. And I would say that's 75% of the people I've interacted with since 1980. And it continues today at about the same frequency. So I haven't seen any difference. So that's in part why I wanted to take the time to kind of do this. Because I mean, I got a small cross section of what's out there. but this is what I'm seeing that's out there. Yeah, well, depends. We have our conversations. We have our conversations. Okay, well, anything else you want to talk about A or B on these positions now? Okay, well, let me just go to the foundations for just a minute of what I wanted, and then we'll see what we got left. Okay, so position A. And again, I'm not taking the time to totally flesh this out. Again, it's kind of a snapshot, but I think you'll get the position. Okay, what's position A's view with regard to God? And the answer is no. It's materialism.
No.
There is no God. All there is material. Their view is that's all exists is material reality. There is no spiritual. So, man, I'll just put Darwin. Okay, they just believe man is Darwinian animal. Yeah. And then C, we already in this view, there's God everywhere. Okay.
Oh, sorry about that.
What do people in the see as significance of saying that man is divine, creation is divine, everything is divine? What is the significance of that? Because then it's no different from saying everything is not. They're all the same. I'm just help me figure out what they would.
Okay.
How
so
they think about that.
In creation, they're going to draw a distinction between wilderness and where man messes with the environment. This is how they're going to. And so what they want to say is the most divine places, the sacred places, are where man has not done his deed to creation. So creation without man's influence is where you experience and how you experience the divine. Where man has interacted with the creation, there's no longer divine, or the divinity is reduced or gone, or there's a variety of ways that that's expressed. So because you only get this feeling, and that's fundamentally what it's about, this religious experience. You get a religious experience when you're in a wilderness. You don't get that same experience when you're in a grass field or a cornfield. Is that helping?
Maybe. I'm confused I'm just confused about how that works in their view, since man is divine and corn would be divine. And
yeah, see that, well, and different people are going to answer all these in different ways. But as I say, yeah, if you're going to make wilderness sacred, but yet we're divine in part of this, yes, how can you not say a cornfield is equally divine?
Okay, so you would see that as a problem with their view.
Sure.
This is just sort of,
yes,
you're characterizing the view, but it's not necessarily that the view is coherent.
Right.
Okay.
This is one of those places where your foundation is having a hard time integrating with your superstructure.
I see. Okay.
For just those kinds of reasons. Is it should be the case that you experience the same thing in a cornfield that you would in a wilderness. But that's not the argument they would make at all, for a variety of reasons.
So if man is also divine, then where does the conclusion that man is a parasite fit in? I mean, is there some, so is there a view of man as broken as well as man as divine? Can you help me?
Yeah. Man isn't totally divine. Man has a little divine part of him. So part of him is divine, the rest of him is not divine. And when man is acting in a way that's contrary to his interaction with creation, I mean, he's interacting with God in a less than a sacred way. Now, the position that man is a parasite Yeah, no, those folks, most of them, well, let me back off and say the majority of them that I've interacted with that want to make the argument that man is parasite, their position about God is Gaia, so that God is in nature, yes, but God is actually will and consciousness in nature. So Gaia could decide, I'm changing the atmosphere tomorrow and doing away with this parasite man dude who's just mucking up my ecosystem. I'm just going to do away with him by changing the atmosphere. So they're pantheistic in that sense. And so that's what they mean by parasite, that in other words, we're not doing anything productive. We're only sucking and destroying the natural ecosystem. Does that make sense? So that's usually the logic I hear with regard to that one. Okay, so now position B. And I've done the majority of this middle position because it centers on Darwin. And so, is there a God? In the middle position, I will grant you there's a wide sort of variety of answer here, but I'll put the sideboards on it in just a second. Okay, so we'll leave God for a minute, but man is an animal. And man is interested in survival. So the rest of creation is just nature. And all of this system together is just in competition basically to continue existence. Okay? Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? So in this view, the problem with this view is, then how do you hold man to a different standard than any other animal? That doesn't make any sense. Why is it only man that you hold to a standard that there's an ethic? If we're an animal just like the rest of the animals, we just differ in degree a little bit from them. But once we want to claim that man has a moral obligation, the problem with that is that makes man unique. And the problem with that is there's no room for that in this. That isn't going, that you can't make that coherent. From an ethical sense, you can't make that coherent. Now, God, there is a way that God is in here, but God is a very limited God. Because what is it really in God's sphere of interest to do here? Because Darwin, he's arguing that all there is matter. And essentially, all of this is just matter and mechanism. And so in science, this idea of a mechanical view of the world, the universe works like a machine. So at the beginning of the Enlightenment, in many ways, Darwin is completion of the revolution in science, because biology is the last field where they get rid of Aristotle and make it purely about matter and a mechanical cause. Mechanical cause is simply natural selection here. So in Darwin's view, the context of this is simply matter and mechanism. So if there is a God, the only role he can have was like a deist. He wound it up in the beginning, and now it's running by itself. That's the only role God could play. If he plays any other role, then how is it then that, what role is he playing with any other animal? What is he doing with those? How could we know anything about him or any of that? Does that make any sense? Do you see where I'm coming from? And so the dominant position here, middle, again, as I say, if this is the foundation of the view, then I got some real problems putting that superstructure on it that talked about stewardship and maintaining other species and all of this stuff. Because again, all there is matter and a mechanism here. It's all about today. There's no tomorrow. It's all about the here and now. This isn't about anything other than the here and now. I don't see on what grounds there's a reason or any grounds for any ethics at all. Now, they're there, but my problem is I can't ground that ethics on this foundation. I can't see how you can do that. So I'm still waiting for that kind of an answer. Yes.
So you would say both A and the middle position use Darwin and as part of their foundation, but you would say that the position A is the one that's using Darwin accurately.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, we have a few minutes. All right. So does this make any sense? Am I completely off here? Any reactions? Yeah, go for it.
If this might be a tweak to the middle position.
Okay.
Can we call, I understand what you're saying about man's culpability. Why is he culpable for any of these? Why they can't be ethical, but what if we removed the ethics question out of it, or the culpability as an equal to all creation or all animals, and say man's advanced knowledge or man's advanced understanding more than any other creative animal brings its own responsibility without God being a piece of the action?
Okay. Well, again, I'm with you if you want to say this, that animals up to man differ by degree in their knowledge. And knowledge equals culpability. Well, what I want to say is, well, even an earthworm's got a little bit of knowledge. So to some little extent, he's culpable then, right? I mean, and so animals that have a large amount of knowledge, they have some culpability, right? Well, if somebody would make that argument, then I'd say, okay, I'm satisfied, but nobody makes that argument. I've never heard the higher apes been held accountable for overpopulating or destroying any of their habitat. They do it all the time, but it's called natural. Elephants, any big organism, orcas eat themselves out of house and home in places and points. I mean, the point is if you're going to hold that standard, then it's by degree. So, I mean, even an earthworm has a little knowledge, so he has a little culpability, is the way the argument has to go. But that's not the argument anybody makes. Only man. Something happened. We get so far up here, and all of a sudden there's a jump. Well, the point is not in Darwin, you don't get any jumps like that. Those are ruled out. There are no jumps of that kind in a Darwinian world.
Unless it's only that which is at the very top has culpability, and that would mean
mean that if something else had more knowledge than us at some point in the future, we wouldn't have any culpability anymore.
Okay. Well, maybe, but maybe. But let me tell you one story here about knowledge and culpability, just for the heck of it. And like I say, this is just for the lighter side. One of the coolest set of experiments I ever saw done were done in the 50s. And they set up mazes that were to scale size-wise. They set up mazes with rats and philosophy students. And then they ran the rat versus the philosophy students in mazes. And guess who won? by so big a margin that it wasn't even funny. So if running mazes has anything to do with the knowledge that's necessary to do the world, then on what grounds do we have the superior knowledge? Anyway, just Bob.
Hey, Charlie, thank you. This has been very educational. I'm venturing to guess that nobody in this room holds any of these three positions. And so I'm wondering if your intent, maybe next week, is to address environmental ethics from the standpoint of what I might term a normal biblical Christian perspective.
That's what I'm planning on doing next week.
Good deal.
So yeah, next week. Yeah, well, so, okay, we got like 1 minute. I'll give you a 1 minute pitch, see if I can get anybody interested in coming back. Is where I'm going to start is we're actually going to start with the foundation. Let's start with the foundation. Who is God? Who is man? Who is the creation? We're going to look at the mandate, Genesis 1, where it says, man, you're to multiply, rule, and then there's that word subdue. It's in Genesis 1. Same words translated later in Ezekiel as put under subjection, as in slavery. That's the only other use of the Hebrew word. As a non-Christian, this is where I would go when I would go after Christians, is if you go to lexicons and stuff, what you're going to see this word that's translated subdue, that means it's often means trample or stomp. That's what the word means. My position was, if that is in fact the position of your God, and that's what he thinks is morally right, I hate him. I want nothing to do with him. So anyway, just to say we've got to deal with that word subdue. It only occurs in one other place, and it's translated subjection. It's putting individuals under slavery. So anyway, so there's a problem, and we need to deal with that. But yeah, so I'm going to start with the foundation, and then I'm going to go to the law, and then we'll go to a few New Testament verses. So for example, Paul in Romans talking about the creation and the relationship of creation to our salvation. What's the linkage there? What's this? Why are we linked with creation when it comes to salvation? So I plan on going there. Okay, so that's the plan for next week. But yeah, I mean, this is an unusual crowd because normally when I've done this a couple times and in a variety of settings. And in a couple cases, I got about 50% of A and B. And that was interesting because it became pretty evident that was the case real quick. And once it went okay, once I was kind of ducking and trying to get to my car before the thing was over. But yeah, anyway, that's what's out there. And as I say, that's what's out there. That's in large part driving a lot of the polarity that we see today, at least with regard to this issue. And so it seems to me the best we can do is try to recognize it, see where it's coming from, and dialogue. I mean, I learn stuff from both sides that I got to deal with and figure out answers to. Anyway, thanks for coming.